My name is Dominique van der Mensfrug. I'm the director of the Center for Global Trade Analysis at Purdue University. This is part of our regular seminar series that we broadcast around the world. I'm very excited about today's presentation. Tom Rutherford, who will be giving the talk today, and is professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has been working with a new consortium, so somewhat like the GTAP consortium, but more focused on US data, and it's called the WiNDC consortium. Tom and his colleagues have been building a states-based database very similar to GTAP for all 50 states of the United States plus the District of Columbia. It is a time series. Tom will get into the details. So it goes from 1992 to more recent years, and it is fully multi-sectoral. I'm particularly excited now because I've been working with Tom on the WiNDC framework with partners in Washington, D.C. And one of the obvious things that came to our mind is, well, how do we integrate this into GTAP and have a fully endogenous link between GTAP and this WiNDC framework? And so that's what Tom and his colleagues have been working on the last few months, and Tom will then tell us a lot more about this project. There have been other attempts at linking GTAP with sub-regional modeling. I can think of efforts in Brazil, in China, and in the EU, but unless I'm mistaken, I think most of those efforts have been kind of soft linking the two models. So this is, I believe, the first attempt to actually have a fully integrated model. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Tom, and Tom, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 minutes and some Q&A or something along those lines?
That sounds about right, yeah. I'm not gonna dwell forever on slides, but I've included more than I can talk about, but I'll try to move forward quickly so we leave some time to talk about things going forward. So
great, the floor is yours, Tom.
Yeah, great, Dominic, thanks a lot. Boy, it's been fun. One of the things that's sort of a silver lining coming out of the pandemic is that it seems like participating in online sort of collaborations has become more sort of commonplace, and it's really productive. So I want to start off by saying it's really been the last, not every week has been, some weeks have been done better than other weeks, but basically on the whole, I think the level of what I'm talking about now, this work on integrating the database we're building with GTAP has gone really smoothly because it's been so many people have been involved. It's really been interesting, fun opportunities for interchange, and I hope that this sort of collaboration continues forward because I think it's really quite productive. My attempt today, so we've a group of us, maybe I don't know, 15 or 20, have been getting together once a week for an hour to talk about how to do this and compare notes, and we've been developing GEMPAC code and GAMS code, and we've been doing stuff on different aggregations. It seems like any given week we have 2 or 3 people chime in with share things, and so that's been really productive. But what I'm going to do today is I'm thinking about the talk. When I put the talk together, I thought, let me go back to the beginning and sort of explain what we're trying to do here with WiNDC to a GTAP user who may not have been aware of what this is about. And then, so the idea will be to try to go through the basic motivation. I'll talk a little bit about our build stream, because part of this is also a philosophical, the motivation for the project is partially philosophical. When I use data that's constructed, I like to see how it's constructed. And the idea is to produce something that's open source is our idea here. And that's sort of the original. I'll go back through the motivation. I'll talk a little bit about the build stream and how we have done things. And then I'll talk a little bit about household disaggregation, because I think the work with GTAP has been motivated by sort of, I don't think, anybody observing events over the past 5 or 6 years can't help but notice that, trade, globalization, and incidents across households are really an important contributor to political dialogue in any number of countries, including my own. And I thought we should be able to do a better job of this. So part of this is to provide a framework for better understanding. My sort of long-term objective is to provide a framework for better understanding the distributional consequences of policy. And that means I want to know both across income and across geography. And so in the current version of the model, we have quintile five household categories across 50 states, or 50 plus DC. And then we take that data set and integrate this into GTAP, and that's our framework. And then, so I'm just going to the work we've been doing sort of intensively the last couple of months. I'm just going to touch on that briefly at the end, but I will provide a concrete example of the 232 steel tariffs and tariff quotas. So I'm going to show how to represent tariff quotas in the framework. And that's just a sort of demonstration that you can kick the wheels and this actually does spin around and you can do it. And all the code I'm sharing today, if you have a GTAP license, you can get it for free. I'll produce a version of the data set. We have a sort of open source. At WiNDC, everything's open source because it's all, we basically share the whole build stream. But with GTAP, Dominique has been generous enough to let us distribute a version that's got 11 regions and 11 sectors. So I'll produce a version of this that's open source as well. So the idea here is to just demonstrate where we're at. And part of that is not that I'm thinking people can pick this up and run with it right off the bat, but perhaps if you find this interesting and relevant, you might like to join our weekly sort of sessions to give us sort of contribute. Let's say, where is this going? I mean, we have a lot of interest from Canada in sort of getting provinces into the model, and there's interest in North American dimensions, so Mexico might be next. And so the idea is that producing a framework for integrating subnational data into GTAP is the ultimate objective here. And the model we've produced is completely parameterized, so you could pour data into it from any of these other places. But it's always the challenges in the details, getting this stuff working. And I'll share where we're at. I'm not saying we've finished, but it's like I think we've made a good progress going forward. So this project goes back to a collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund in 2017. We were working on state level climate policy and looking at the effects. I guess the objective was, it goes back actually further behind this. It goes back to work that Justin Caron did on his thesis at ETH, and he worked on subnational policy and state level data, looking at California climate policy. And here we were working on New York State and RGGI sort of regulations and so forth. So this was a work we did together with EDF. It was quite successful, I thought. And part of this was an idea to try to do something that we could share open source. And I should say this was all part of Andrew Schreiber's dissertation. So Andrew was really the main, did all the heavy lifting on this. I kind of knew where the bodies were buried and where you could get stuff, but he and I worked a little bit together, but he did a lot of detailed work on this. So this was an attempt to reconcile state level data with Census Bureau data with sort of energy, the state energy data system from EIA. So our basic idea was to produce a set of transparent tools for producing subnational economic accounts that could be used for general equilibrium or input-output analysis within the US. And this is this idea that there are such data sets around, and but I was always kind of unhappy because when you do general equilibrium modeling, it's sort of a guaranteed you'll find anomalies in your data set. As soon as you go to build a model, you find something that's not exactly consistent. And I like to be able to find out where the inconsistency comes from. Is this inconsistency across published data? Whereas if you have a closed sort of data set you're working with, you can patch it up, but it's not as satisfying to know that maybe there's a mistake in how you did it and you'd like to know what the mistake was. So this was the basic idea. I mean, we have some grand objectives, and I think a lot of the work we've done has been successful. A lot of this was due to work by Adam, our original postdoc is now at GAMS. And Adam's work was really original in the sense that he immediately caught on to the fact that a lot of the upstream source data could be more easily manipulated using these libraries that run under Python. So we developed a bunch of Python tools. We still use GAMS for doing all our balancing and so forth, but the upstream stuff is all done with Python. And Adam Christensen was essential in that. And most of the tools we developed early on are now provided through, I forget what it's called. I mean, Martha might be able to tell me. GAMS now has a web page.
GAMS transfer.
GAMS transfer. So you can go and find the tools we're using. So that was quite successful. We had ambitions to sort of go beyond GAMS to run things open source. We do have an open source. We provide an accessible license for our build stream, even though it's in GAMS. If you don't have a GAMS license, you can run this using Neos, which operates here at University of Wisconsin. And we've also would like to produce models to run both in GAMS and in Julia Jump. But I have to admit that I'm sort of an old dog, and learning to use Julia has been I've been a little bit slower with that. But the idea is to provide options for building the data set in these foundations. Now, a lot of people have worked with Implan. So Implan is sort of the go-to, and Implan has done a very nice job. And this was Greg Alward from early on. I would say the interesting thing about Implan is you go to work with Implan, you can feel, boy, somebody really knew what they were doing when they put this data set together. And then you dig a little deeper and you find that Sherman Robinson was sort of instrumental in the early development. So you can see why this whole thing makes sense. Greg is great input output, econometric guy, and then together with Sherman. And so this was a really nice data set, but I was always kind of frustrated with this lack of transparency, and you don't really know how things are reconciled. And I'd like to see exactly where stuff comes from. So that was more our idea. And also, I mean, to be honest, it's expensive. So you tell a graduate student, hey, why don't you use Implan for this analysis? It's like, man, they have to raise thousands of dollars to do their thesis work. So I like the idea that we can produce something that's sort of more open source and can be used for doing distributional analysis within the states without having to justify this on a large consulting contract. I'm in no way, I mean, we worked with guys at Implan, and I like Implan, and I still think it's useful, but that's the idea, is to move beyond that. So we developed this framework working with EDF, and the build stream basically is, it's this sequence of operations beginning from BA summary tables, partitioning things to run in GAMS, do matrixing balancing on the national table to reconcile things, and then we then have this process where we generate shares at the state. We look at state level data to share things out. We do this regionalization that basically is taking the input-output coefficients to the national level and bring them down to the state. Verify consistency. One of the things we do is, again, it's just, I'm sort of codified the way I typically work is I go from model to model. So at each of these steps, there's a model at each step that identifies how things are structured. And this gives us then a data set. And you end up with the data set that's at the national level, disaggregated to the states, and then you can go on further. We call our state energy data system based model Blue Note, sort of tipping a hat to the fact that Andrew is such a good jazz trumpet player. So I thought this would be a good name. Otherwise, there's no real. We have some acronym that defines it, but Blue Note is a sort of attempt at that framework, and that provides basically a nice time series of these data sets. We haven't worked on estimation from the time series, but we have tools to produce all the data in all the years. And so this gives us the supply and use tables, although the thing is diagonal, so the supply tables are sort of simple up, but there's a few byproduct matrices, but these can be diagonalized. And then we use GAMS to partition these into a CGE framework, and that gives you a framework for leveraging. In the standard, the summary tables are at like 59 sectors, but you can also split out additional sectors. I've been sort of slow about getting back to the NAS, the agricultural census data, because we've been working heavily on it with GTAP, but ultimately the idea is to get back to the version of the database we had that had the NAS table and be able to have a better aggregation with GTAP. For right now, we're working with the standard sort of summary tables. We do some stuff on balancing. We have ordinary least squares. We do some stuff with, we have a version that works with an entropy-based method again, but also we've explored for the energy environment work. We work a lot with Huber because it gives us a method. Huber gives us a method for putting a greater weight on small coefficients. So early on, our attention was trying to develop a asymmetric thing that would basically not drop small coefficients, so you keep the database on the environmental dimensions, which may have small value but high importance. So we did a lot of work on this. It turns out it doesn't matter all that much. I mean, you have a problem with dropping coefficients, but otherwise the L2, this least squares method is pretty darn good. And so we have a couple methods, but the beauty of working with GAMS is you can have several different frameworks, and you can, so we built a working method where we work with least squares for most sort of balancing, and we can go back and rerun everything with other frameworks. Regionalization then begins from gross state product, personal consumer expenditures, state finance tables, some trade statistics, although that's sort of the interpretation of those is tricky. Commodity flow survey, there's some other constructed data sets for intra-state trade, and we've sort of struggled a little bit with that, but we have produced a version of the model with a pooled national trade flow, and we also have a version where we can bring in CFS data to recalibrate. And then in the core model, we have household demand separated from government demand, separated from investment, separated from intermediate demand. And that gives us sort of a sense about how stuff is organized. I don't know, is this guy over top? Let me see if I can maybe share this guy. Hide. I don't know how to, let's see if I can move this guy off. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so regionalization, I won't dwell on that further. And trade's a little bit trickier, and so bilateral trade flows were represented from CFS. We also can go to Canada produces these D-level tables that have explicit representation of trade, and so we estimated a gravity model from there. Got a very extremely tight match with which leads me to believe not that the gravity model is good, but probably the Canadians used the gravity model for specifying the data in the first place. But anyways, we have a couple different ways of going in trade. So that's the build routine. The sort of the core build return produces this stuff from 1997 to 2017, 71 sectors, sort of several different things. So that gives our data sources and so forth. So in the last year and a half or 2 years, we've worked hard on household disaggregation. Again, this is largely, I'm leaning very heavily on Andrew's work. So, the state level data set is good. It gives you a sense about what gets produced where, but this income classification I thought was also important. When we do the income classification, we reconcile savings and investment as well. And that one of again, this is, I'm getting old, so I have pet peeves that I've developed over the years about how stuff works. And one of my pet peeves is always this dissatisfaction with the emphasis on static equilibrium and input-output tables. When in fact, many times you want to build a forward-looking model, and you have this sort of calibration of investment to match savings is always there. And oftentimes in CG models, that reconciliation is done sort of as an afterthought at the point where you bring in the household. So here we try to actually do the reconciliation of static and steady state as part of the build stream. So we produce several different models, and then we also produce focusing largely on sources of income and tax liability, as we focus on income, tax liability, where do people's money, how much money do people have and where does it come from? And then we take a very light touch on expenditure differences. So we don't work a lot on, we don't use the CPS to look at expenditure compositions. We simply take in a set of income elasticities across commodities and use those to tie down the expenditure side. And again, this is just over the years, I've worked a lot on different CG models looking at households. And almost always it seems to be the case that income is what really matters, that the expenditure differences are not sufficient to really drive things. Of course, there can be income elasticities. There may be different patterns across households, but it's also this observation that most of these our models don't have big changes in incomes, therefore income elasticity. Anyway, so this is our our basic approach. So when we do the household recalibration, we have two different data sets that we work from, the current population survey and the IRS statistics of income. We're carrying both these along now. Andrew and I have we've taken runs at the paper a couple of times. Once we get the paper written up, we'll probably just go with one of the CPS, but for the time being, we have both of these, so you have a choice. And it's also then roughly 5 households. You have this trade-off between the number of households and how much precision you have, but 5 households seems to work pretty well. So that, and it's close to quintiles, but not exactly. So that's this idea about reconciling income balance in the original data set is at the regional level. And so now we want to basically move to a reconciliation of consumption expenditure, tax liability, savings, and that's equals wages plus capital income plus transfers. And so we have a way of breaking this other. So we've looked at this from a couple different approaches, and then we control those. So one, the CPS is a survey data set, the SOI is an administrative data set. So there's some differences there. You're working with numbers of returns. So there's this issue about households versus individuals. There's some differences in terms of interpretation. That's the reason that when we first built this, I thought it would be useful to carry along both data sets so we can identify, does this matter? And at this point, the answer is it doesn't matter that much. You can find differences in the calibrated values, but in terms of simulations, this is not the biggest factor that drives results. So there's the SOI and CPS categories. Anyway, so this is all provided just for your interest. One thing that's important to bear in mind is that they're roughly quintiles, but not exactly. So the comparison, they're not exactly perfect in terms of their income classifications. And there's also some difference. The SOI data doesn't have exactly the same number of household groups in each one. So there's some differences here in terms of how these guys are shared out. The CPS, we have an exact, the number of households, number of returns is not the same because returns, you have two individuals can just file the same return with the joint. So that there's some differences in terms of how the households are defined.
Tom, can I ask a question?
Sure.
How difficult would it be to use some other classification of households? I'm thinking of sector of employment or occupation or something along those lines.
Yeah, so we have a calibration procedure that I've developed last year that we've not put into the build stream yet, but actually I just agreed to send it to Jared Carbone, so I have to actually get this together. But we have a thing that looks at employment categories. One of the things is that it has more types of employment, and then we came up with a procedure for mapping employment categories onto households, onto the 5. Now, if you were to use that, so that's somewhat easier to do than saying, okay, we're going to have many more households, so we take the 5 and then we split it out into category of employment. So and then get differences in the income. I'm not sure that you could, that the data, whether it's going to support a lot more households, but clearly you could know for each household category that we have here what the importance is of the different classifications. So that's something we're thinking about. Yeah, maybe someone who's better at this. Surely a labor economist might be able to come at this and do a better job than we've done. But we wanted to get something running. So I'm happy with what we have now, but I'd welcome interaction with someone who's done this more. So this is in the household stuff, we solve for the steady state equilibrium investment. That's basically, if you're on a steady state, then you have growth plus depreciation that's got to be equal to savings rate plus, anyway, there's this dynamic consistency, which is not in the static input output table that you have to impose if you want to have a dynamic model. And so we do that reconciliation, and then we solve the income routine to aggregate households, and then so there's several different steps here in doing this. We do this subsequent sort of calibration. This basically gives us, doing this, we found this was a more robust way than trying to solve everything in one go. So that's where we were sort of at the end of last year by by September, and then we started to think about trade at that point, and that's where we come into GTAP. And so this is much more recent stuff that we've been working on in this group. So this is collaboration with, I don't want to impugn anyone else on this work, but this is sort of where we're at. So this have this sectoral reconciliation with 33 sectors representing aggregation. So we find a sectoral classification which gets a pretty good match between GTAP and WiNDC structures. That's something that's subject to change, because if we can pull out and reclassify WiNDC to match the agricultural census, which is something that, you know, Ron Sands is very keen on doing this for his farm model. So we have a lot of reason to do that, but we could break out another 5 or 6 sectors, the agricultural trade sectors, which I think would be important for WiNDC, and so I'm hoping we'll do that. Of course, the version of our build stream, if you have a GTAP license, then you can pick any regions you want to. If you want to use the WiNDC stuff, have a GTAP-based model in WiNDC, then you're fixed to the 11 regions, 11 commodities that we chose. Aggregate trade, so GTAP controls trade within the border in the US is controlled by WiNDC. So we have this sort of alignment that WiNDC has the input-output table, GTAP has trade. We do some reconciliation to balance these. A lot of the work on the sectoral classification, Ala Golub, I have to call out to her. She's done a fantastic job of thinking carefully about how to divide this stuff up. And we're still in the process of sort of sorting through how we can handle this. There's, of course, always this challenge about classification. We have the central CPC classification, and then we have this embedded. So the GTAP classification is somewhat different than the NAICS, and so we have to sort of get these guys reconciled. So now, just to show, I'll conclude just by going through an example. I'll just show you a model. I'm not going to go through all the details, but I'm going to show you sort of how the model is structured so you can see what goes on. So this is sort of the GTAP and GAMS framework. And you know, we need to update this to more recent. We have a more recent GTAP and GAMS framework that we're using to reconcile. So I have to get this stuff documented. I've been a little bit slow. My paper with Bruno Lantz is from a few years ago is one place you could go. Again, I should apologize because I tend to use MPSG for doing reconciliation just because it's easier to see what's happening for me. Anyway, I can modify the model. So I'm going to show a little bit about how this works. And this is one of the things I would admit that I'm sort of struggling with, is that I'd like to, and I should also say the folks at GTAP, Maxime and Dominique and company have produced a version of this that runs in GEMPAK as well. So we're sort of trying to get several different platforms going at one time, but right now I'm going to just show you one that's done in MPSG just because that's the way I tend to work. So in the MPSG-based model, we have a sector I, which is commodities, R, which is regions, and then to bring in GTAP or WiNDC, then we have S, which are subregions, which would be, think of that as states, and then H, which is households. So that's what's going on. The sector G represents the sectors in I together with investment and public expenditure. So unlike GTAP, which has separate symbols representing private expenditure and investment and government and public expenditure, I just roll that into one set G, and then I map preferences as well as public expenditure, composition of public expenditure, as well as you know, all that stuff gets mapped onto G. When we have households, then I have a separate consumption activity formed by region US, by state, and by household. In all the other regions in the data set, there's just a stub. That means S is other, is basically all, there's one composite region. So S is singleton for all regions other than the US. And H is a singleton for all regions other than the US. So in the US, we have 50, S represents 51 subregions and 5 households. So we have 250 different consumption activities within the US. All other regions in the GTAP-WiNDC data set have just one region R, one consumption activity for each R. There's this disposition activity that allocates output to either. So we have used the 1, 2, 3 model for representing sort of production structure. So stuff that gets produced either gets supplied to the to within the state, or it gets allocated to a national market, or it gets allocated to exports. So there's this allocation across destinations. And then we have an Armington demand structure that, again, reaggregates intermediate demand comes from within the state, or from the national market, or from an international imported market. Right now, we don't have differences. I mean, the data set currently does not distinguish between the import composition of the composition of imports by state. So this was something that Justin Heron, in an early paper back in 2007, argued, but using IMPLAN and additional data, argued that you have to be careful about the fact that China tends to be more California tends to be more China-based, whereas New York tends to be more European-based. So this distinction between the import composition, that's something that requires some additional estimation of some sort of gravity representation. We haven't done that in the current version of the model. So right now we have this import activity M of I comma R, which is composite imports. That's the same for all states. And so, and that means that from M down, it's exactly the same as the GTAP activity. And we have this YT is this transportation activity that's the same. If we look at prices, it corresponds to the same sort of idea. We have this, we have an output price from activities. We have a Arlington composite price for absorption. We have a domestic price, imports, national market price P of I comma R. And then we have a price of end use consumption by region, subregion, or region, subregion, household. Again, the subregion only comes into play in the US setting. We have 51 subregions and 5 households, and all other regions in the data set, we have just 1 subregion and 1 household. And then there are factor prices that are for mobile aggregate. All factors have a composite price, and then sector-specific primary factors then are the ones that have a sluggish allocation using through the allocation of goods. And then we have this transportation services. Again, that's no difference from the original GTAP model. Again, representative households, government, and investment then are distinguished as separate consumers. Now, one of the challenges for me in this work is that, you know, I tend to not usually give models names. I basically give me a policy and I build a model to match the policy. And so that's the way I always work. And one of the challenges I'm struggling with WinDC is coming up with a framework that I wish I was good at programming as Mark Horridge is. You know, Mark can basically sit down and code up a nice Windows interface that basically makes GEMPAC accessible to a much wider audience of users. Whereas in sort of the GAMS MPSG world, if you know GAMS MPSG, life is really easy. You can do all sorts of stuff. But if you don't know it, it's really hard to work with the model. And that's one of the things I'm still struggling with, is how to build models that can be useful to people if they don't want to go up the learning curve on how to use it. And so I'm still struggling a bit with that. So I put together an application here just to illustrate how I would use the GTAP-WiNDC model. And this came out of discussions with folks from the Commerce Department, which were interested in sort of the steel quotas, which were imposed under the previous presidential regime. There's currently a dialogue about how to remove those steel tariffs, the so-called 232 tariffs, which were roughly 25% on imports of steel from a number of different trading partners. And so one of the proposals for getting rid of these is to replace them with some sort of tariff quota, where you have in quota and out quota tariff rates, and that way you can keep a control on what happens if you relax the tariff rate, what happens to the level of imports coming in. And so my approach to this is, okay, you give me the policy and I grab the canonical GTAP-WiNDC model, and then I stick some additional stuff in to represent the policy. So if I'm going to represent this policy, I need to track bilateral exports, because on quota constrained trade, I need to keep track of how much imports come in quota and how much comes in out of quota. And here I'm going to lean heavily on Matheson's complementarity formulation, in the sense that I declare B, but if out of quota tariffs are too high, then B will go to 0. So it's not, the model will choose which of these is how it breaks even. And that means that on those, I have to keep track of what the price is of the bilateral import. That's actually the bilateral export price of commodity I from region RR to R. And I also keep track of the quota rents that apply on these guys. And then I have to take my CES armored composite Z, and I have to disaggregate this to incorporate the bilateral trade flow. So this says, if I'm importing good I from region RR to region R, I have to buy some of that composite good, the VXMD. GTAP users are familiar with that. What that represents the value of imports, CIF. It's FOB, that's the FOB value of imports. And then I have to apply perhaps an export subsidy, and there may be an import tariff. And here I replace RTMS, the bilateral tariff, by RTMS _ Q, because it's going to depend. I may apply a different tariff on in quota and out of quota trade. And so that's where RTMS _ Q is applied. And then that quota, the tariff also applies on the transport cost that's added to the trade. And then to capture the quota rent, then I have to basically, let me hide this. Then I have to apply if there is a quota, then I have to put in a PQ activity that represents that quota. And so that gives me a way of capturing quota. And so that's simply the way right now. And what I'll do is I'll share this model. I'm not going to go through more detail, but I have copious comments in the code. So if you want to sort of see how you can take this model and do that. My original intention, I should apologize for the lack of truth in advertising. So originally I was going to do something on what happens to markets for Russian oil and gas. And I also want to do something on what happens to markets for grain exports and oilseed exports from Ukraine. So you could do a similar sort of thing. I'm afraid I was able to get this guy a nice clean version of this model on 232 tariffs, but I don't have those other two running yet. But that's my intention, is when I write up the paper about GTAP-WINDC, I'm interested in looking at what the incidence is of a set of shocks that are applied to a GTAP model and be able to trace that through. And of course, I'm kind of keen also to understand how does this, one of the cool reasons about having a hard link model is that then we can ask how does this differ from what would happen if I guess the Australians would do this, I forget John's last name, James and John, the regional guys at COPS, do all this cool modeling where they do tops down. So they come in after the fact, they'll use GTAP to do the model, and they just use the shares to understand what the regional impacts are. And so one of the things that's an interesting question is here, how much causality do we have going up as well as down? So if you run the GTAP model and say, let's share out the impacts on the states, how does that compare with a model where you have the thing tightly linked? And so my suspicion is the answer is not much. So in fact, but then the advantage of having the tightly linked model is you can answer the question, does it matter or not? Even if the answer is not intriguing, you can answer it, you can understand the effects. So, but right now I just have one hard link model. I can model the effects back. And if you look at that, then this shows the effect. This is the 232 tariff. This is the welfare impact across households. Of course, then you see states like Hawaii, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Nevada, the ones that are not dependent on steel inputs, they're going to be improved from the tariff quota, and then the ones that are more dependent on the use of steel are going to be hurt. And this is what happens if then that's the 232, and then you can see additionally what happens if you apply the tariff quota on top of that. So if you replace it by the tariff quota, you get a distributional effect. This is really just an attempt to demonstrate. What I'm trying to do with this example is demonstrate that this is where I want to go. I want to be able to do a simulation that's policy relevant and answer the question of does it matter? And that's what we produce here. And we don't have a tool that's got a Windows interface, but I will say that I do generate this example provides you with a nice assessment. So basically I demonstrate how you can run the model dump the stuff into a pivot table and look at the results. So that here we have a number where you can choose what sector you want to look at, and you could say, okay, what happens to electrical equipment from the effect. So you can look at the effects across states, and then you can also look at welfare, and you can look at welfare. This is welfare percentage change relative to 2014 benchmark. You can look at what happens if I look at it as a percentage of the 232 benchmark, and then you can see the effects across states of this effect. So that's just simply to say that this does operate. We can do a simulation where this works. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, including, and again, I'm really kind of sad we're losing Martha Lowe has been our administrative assistant. She's done an absolutely spectacular job with WINDC of keeping the stuff organized. And so you can go to this thing in our resource center. You can download if you want to catch up on what we've been doing. This thing has, you can get recordings and shared files from all the work we've done in GTAP. So that's the end of what I have today. When I post the slides here, I'll also be happy. I'll also post the GAMS code for what I've showed today, just as a starting point. So I'd say we're sort of at the point where sort of the beginning of this sort of process. I'm hoping that this is something that can promote the use of more attention to the impact of trade, both on geographic, on an income category basis. Yeah, so that's what I have to share. So I'm done.
Tom, as I said at the beginning, I think this is a really stimulating work. So thanks a lot for introducing it. Nelson has his hand up, but before I get to that, there's a question in the chat about, do you know of any efforts to do this in the UK?
You know, if we hadn't done a policy analysis which was so damning on the economic effects of Brexit, I probably would be doing it in the UK, but we've not been invited back since we produced a report that said Brexit was a bad idea. So the thing is, I did look at the data. So I have regional data in the UK, and so UK has this NUTS 2, NUTS 3 distinction, and that's also that'd be great to do that in the UK. It also, Germany has a long tradition of Johannes Brücker's tradition of doing regional analysis. In Germany is very. I spent some time with George Dresden. There's a bunch of groups that are good. So I'm hoping that. And part of the reason we want to share what we're doing is that someone who's working in another environment could hopefully take our tools and be able to use it. So I don't know if anyone's working in the UK. I would welcome someone to join the project to do that.
Yeah, we've been working a lot with the Department of International Trade, which has kind of taken over the work that you've been doing, Tom. But I don't know if they have any efforts right now to look at a regional version of their work. Nelson, let me give you the floor.
Thanks, Dominique. Thanks, Tom. Very interesting, indeed, very intriguing and refreshing. One question: at the state level, do you replicate the CG structure of GTAP, the nesting, or how does it work? The GTAP passes prices and the states take them as exogenous, or it's a full CG all the way to the household?
So I guess the simple answer is it's a full CG all the way to the household. So if I look at, everything is here. There's a few more exception operators here than what I showed in my slides, but there's the model. And the model I presented, let's see if it fits on one screen. Not quite, but basically that's the whole structure is there. So the whole model is like, and so the thing is, there's a lot of emphasis put, and again, this is just, I'm not trying to be defensive. I'm just trying to share, this is where I'm at. Like I've been modeling for a long time. I use MPSG because I don't have to make these decisions about what structure do I use for the nesting and how I handle. That's a very important decision if you have to write Fortran code to represent your model. That's a crucial decision you have to make, because if you change your mind, then you've got weeks and weeks of work to redo it. Mm-hmm. The way I work is, what should we do today? Oh, let's do this aggregation. Boom! I can change the structure on the fly, because in MPSG I can define the nesting structure however I want to, And so the important thing is just with MPSG models to make sure you look carefully at what you've done to be able to report how it's structured. But I'm not that, how you structure the model is completely up to you, but everything is there. This is all comes out of a single model, one shot, solve the model, boom.
Okay. Okay.
If I could add on to that. So Tom mentioned the work that we're doing here at the center. So we do have a version of Tom's model that hones very closely to kind of the GTAP standard model. But everything's fully endogenous, yeah.
I'd say the advantage of what Dominique's done is he's more careful than I am about the naming of things. I tend to always change names on stuff, whereas he went back and made sure that it matches. So if you're a GTAP modeler and you use GEMPAC, you're going to do much better if you pay attention to what Dominique has. Although the thing is, the stuff I'm happy to share what I have, and so yeah. So my idea is use the tool. Once you move up the learning curve on one approach, use what you're familiar with. But let's make sure that the data is documented and clear, and we know how to move data sets between different formats.
Okay, so it's a bit like the GTAP approach. One database that it's consistently created, you understand it, you put your model on top of that, I can put mine, and etc. Yeah, okay. Yep.
I don't see any other hands up right now. There are some more in the chat. So someone from William Flynn from DIT, the Department of International Trade in the UK, says that they are looking into this. So that's good news. From Madan, any plan for taking it further to develop a framework for a dynamic CG model for climate policy analysis?
Yeah, before we did the GTAP link, we have a sort of a canonical dynamic Ramsey-based model that matches this. And yeah, I'd say for sure this is anything that's forward-looking. Of course, I would, the thing is, there are lots of different ways of doing this. I would point people to the Peter Dixon and Maureen Rimmer have this nice monograph on how to do dynamic modeling. They've done a lot of stuff with endogenous. So I think there's lots of room for how to handle forward projections and how to put this in the database. So yeah, I'd say yes. I would say that the main thing we try to do here, we're kind of agnostic about what the dynamics are, but at the end of the day, you need to have a database that can be calibrated to assumptions about investment and GDP growth. And we pay attention to that when we do the calibration. So if you look in the data file we produce, you tell it whether you want to take. You can choose to use a static model, which is calibrated more or less precisely to the BA input output table, or you can choose to have a dynamic calibration where you calibrate it to assumption to what the growth rate is in the base year, and then that adjusts investment and consumption to have those things be balanced.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Tom said there, I think, and we had this discussion with Tom, is, there is a lot of kind of embedded CES-ness there, all the way down to, the household level in the state. So when you calibrate those share parameters to your base year data, so if you're doing long run dynamics, you have to worry about how much you've baked in the results to those calibrated parameters. Now, we have that in the standard global model as well, but you're just taking that level of nesting down to the state. So you're really, really baking in a lot. I don't know, have you given some additional thought to that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we moved more toward an empirical approach where we estimated elasticities. I mean, that's sort of on my list of things to do, is to better. And we have a very productive postdoc here who does empirical work. She's currently working on, she has a cool paper about beer sales, and she works on taxes on soda and so forth. And she's always just estimating stuff. So I'm hoping Ling Xiao and I will be able to collaborate more on some more empirical. work on estimating these things. The functional form, I'm not quite so, I don't know, I think it's a matter of functional form. It's a matter of sort of what has empirical evidence for which goods should be differentiated and what's the right elasticity to assume is the crucial question. Yeah.
Good.
I should apologize to people for putting you off. I had grand ambitions to do something on the Ukrainian analysis, and I postponed it. I should have just anyway. So my apologies for canceling the last minute last time. I was really not ready, and so I appreciate having the chance. You guys gave me a get out of jail free card. That was helpful.
All right. Since I'm not seeing any further questions, either by hand or in the chat box, let me thank you a lot, Tom, for this stimulating discussion. As Tom mentioned, a lot of this stuff you can just download directly from the WiNDC database. So if you want to pursue this further, please check that out. And also, we'd love to see additional people at the weekly GTAP-WINDC meeting. So the more the merrier. So
yeah, the one comment I make, if you're working in another country, our meetings are not specifically just for US based stuff. So if you're working on another country and you want to have a chance to interact, we'd love to have other countries. It's great. Let's work in parallel. It's like we can share, development can go faster.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to all of you who have attended. And we'll keep you posted on the next webinar in this series. Thanks again. Cheers.